You're not just allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. You have to have a very good reason. That's not only if you're a person. It should surely apply also if you're a malach. So how come the malachim from Eretz Yisrael went to welcome Yaakov in? Where do we see that? At the end of our parasha, if in Pasuk Vayifko Boi Malach Elokim, when the Torah describes that Yaakov Avinu is coming back to Eretz Yisrael, and the Pasuk says that he encountered angels of Hashem, Zogner Azal, so Chazal say, and Rashi quotes it, so it's in the Medrash, or Rashi brings us Befirush al Torah, Rashi quotes it, as dos seine given, Malachim shel Eretz Yisrael, bo likrasai lelavoisei loretz. That these were Malachim that belong in Eretz Yisrael, that came to welcome and to accompany Yaakov into Eretz Yisrael. From Pashas Haloshen is moving as the or to Vudi Malach Eretz Yisrael Bali Krasa is given b'chutz la'aretz. So you read this at face value, and it sounds like the Malachim from Eretz Yisrael came out of Israel in order to welcome Yaakov in. Nacheder is angekommen in Eretz Yisrael before Yaakov Avinu came into Eretz Yisrael. What we need to understand is in Tchil Asa Parasha, at the beginning of this parasha, from Pasuk, commenting on the pasuk about Yaakov's dream with the ladder, where it says Oidim v'Yordim, by that there were Malachim first going up and then Malachim coming down. Shtei Medrash, the Medrash there says Malachim shemelavim sodom be'Eretz Yisrael ein melavim noisem b'chutz la'aretz. That Malachim that accompany a person inside Eretz Yisrael cannot accompany the person outside of Eretz Yisrael. Und Rashi sagt das noch mehr mefarish. Rashi says it even more clearly. Malachim shlivu ba'aretz ein yotzim b'chutz la'aretz. The Malachim that accompanied Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael are not allowed to go out of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, they had to go up to heaven, and Malachim of Chutz had to come get him to accompany Yaakov out of Eretz Yisrael. So if that's the case, if the rule is that the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael cannot go out, how come now when Yaakov is coming back from Chorin to Eretz Yisrael, the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael do exit Eretz Yisrael in order to welcome him? So the Gur Aryeh is Mazvir as Vibaldas Gigangan Ken Eretz Yisrael. The Gur Aryeh gives an explanation, which is because Yaakov is coming back to Eretz Yisrael. So the Gur Aryeh says that those Malachim from Eretz Yisrael who were coming to greet Yaakov coming back to Eretz Yisrael, they were there to secure him, to keep him safe. They are the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael. They want Yaakov to be back in Eretz Yisrael, so they come to ensure that there's no impediment to his arrival. It makes sense that mission to ensure that Yaakov is not delayed coming to Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael. Whereas the security provided by the Malachim of Chutz La'aretz, that accompanied him to Eretz Yisrael, that was just to protect him from any external threats. But the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael have to make sure that there's no delays to get to Eretz Yisrael. That's their unique job, so they've got to come and they've got to accompany him. The Rebbe is not altogether happy with that answer. The Tiritz is it's not such a smooth answer. We're talking about the same road, the same path that Yaakov Avinu is traveling. So therefore, the Alucha B'chutz La'aretz Yisrael, we're describing the journey is taking from Chutz La'aretz into Eretz Yisrael. Why do I need two types of protection? The Malachi Chutz La'aretz Hositnim Baderech, those same Malachim of Chutz La'aretz who protecting Yaakov from harm on this path, obviously if there's no harm, there's no obstacle to getting to Eretz Yisrael. Why do we have to bring the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael to do that? Therefore the Rebbe concludes, for them is mistaver loyme, that logically, as the Malach Eretz Yisrael boli krasa nor le lavoisai, that the reason the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael came to greet Yaakov Avinu was only to accompany, not to protect him. Now, l'shem kavod bilvad, their escort is out of respect. Respect for Yaakov Avinu, they come to welcome him in. If that's the case, it's tzarich bir, then we have to understand, v'kumt as tzilib kvoid Yaakov. How is it possible that out of respect and honor of Yaakov Avinu, not because of an urgent need to protect him, we're going to send Malachim of Eretz Yisrael that are not supposed to leave. We're going to send them to Chutz La'aretz in order to give him this honor God. Contrary to the principle that Rashi already identified, that they don't leave Eretz Yisrael, so now we're going to break that rule in order to give him covered. How does that work? And the interesting thing is, Rashi doesn't talk about it. Considering that the reason for the question has to do with the language that that Rashi used at the beginning of the parasha, where he said that the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael cannot leave, And yet Rashi here doesn't explain it at all. He doesn't explain the apparent contradiction. Muslim we have to conclude. As from Pashas, the Sheinoi Shel Rashi Gufa is moving to Mavur de Inyan. Must be that the way that Rashi is telling us the story already holds the answer to this apparent contradiction. In fact, the information he gives us is so clear that there actually is no question, which requires an answer. So how do we get to see that there's no question over here? So the simple answer is, what are the halachic parameters of not leaving Eretz Yisrael if you're a malach? The beginning of the parasha tells us about how Yaakov Avinu left Eretz Yisrael to go outside, out of Eretz Yisrael. Is moving. So at this point we can understand why the malachim of Eretz Yisrael don't go with him. Because they're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Makes sense, perfectly logical. The malachim can't leave. Mashen came a safe parasha, but the end of the parasha, the story is the exact opposite story. Now we're talking about Yaakov Avinu returning towards Eretz Yisrael. So they were permitted. To maybe they were even required to come to Chutz La'aretz. Because the purpose of going to Chutz La'aretz is to accompany him to Eretz Yisrael, which is their place and their responsibility. In fact, if the Malachim are going to bring Yaakov into Eretz Yisrael, their movement doesn't even qualify as leaving Eretz Yisrael. The whole problem is you're not allowed to go out of Eretz Yisrael. What they're doing does not qualify as going out of Eretz Yisrael. How do we know that? Let's look at the halacha v'yumtak. This will be easier to appreciate. If we qualify that the reason Malachi Eretz Yisrael cannot leave is because of the halachic requirements of people in Eretz Yisrael not to leave. And therefore they have the same parameters as the halacha. In Hem Isser, Lotzes Eretz Yisrael, Chutz La'aretz. If the parameters of their restriction are the same as the parameters of the restriction of any person leaving Eretz Yisrael. So what's the halacha about leaving Eretz Yisrael? The Rambam paskint, the Rambam rules, as asur latzes Eretz Yisrael Chutz La'aretz le'olam. Fascinating lashon. The Rambam says you may never leave Eretz Yisrael, ela except lilmod Torah or lisa isha, if it's for the purpose of studying Torah or getting married, or latzim arakim, or to save somebody who's threatened by the nations of the world. But then you've got to come back. So you could say, one second, those are the only reasons that you're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, to learn, to find a wife, and to fight to save Jews. How is that possible? The Gemara tells a story about Rav Asi, and whenever you have a story about a great scholar, that is the way you're supposed to conduct yourself. As Misarois from Eretz Yisrael, it's the Krasimoi that he left Eretz Yisrael to go greet his mother who was coming from Chutz La'aretz. And there was a whole discussion in the Gemara whether or not he should have done it. From that, the Meiri says clearly, as mutter lotzes Eretz Yisrael lechutz la'aretz, a person is permitted to leave Eretz Yisrael, likras aviv or likras imoy, to welcome one's father or mother, v'chein sha'ar minei kavod, or any other honorable. In other words, you're going to show honor to somebody, you can go out and you can greet them and bring them back. So hang on a second, why is that not in the Rambam's list of reasons that you're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael? So there's a very important halachic distinction here. The fact that the Rambam says one is permitted to leave Eretz Yisrael for the purposes of Torah study, marriage, or to save a life, is it that is considered leaving Eretz Yisrael. But the Torah gives you the right to leave Eretz Yisrael under those circumstances. But it is considered halachically leaving Eretz Yisrael. Whereas when a person leaves Eretz Yisrael to welcome in one's parents, to show kavod, in other words, to go greet them when they're on the way to Eretz Yisrael, that does not qualify as leaving Eretz Yisrael. Yes, geographically you stepped out of the borders for a brief period, but it's not considered leaving Eretz Yisrael because the reason you're going there is only to bring them into Eretz Yisrael. It's quite logical why this is. The other three examples, learning Torah, getting married, saving lives, the only reason you're leaving is because the thing that you want to do, which is a mitzvah, is to be done outside of Eretz Yisrael. So you want to do this mitzvah, you want to learn Torah, you got to go there. You want to marry this woman, you got to go there. You want to save this person, you got to go there. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all, or even sometimes a specific time frame allocated. You don't know how long it's going to take till the person has fulfilled their requirements of Torah learning. You don't know how long it's going to take to go fulfill the marriage, etc. Whereas when a person leaves Eretz Yisrael in order to greet and welcome his parents, where they are coming into Eretz Yisrael. The entire purpose of this journey is not for anything in Chutz La'aretz. Not to live verbunden Eretz Yisrael. The whole mission, the entire journey is linked to and for the purpose of Eretz Yisrael. Ho aliyah le'Eretz Yisrael, to bring them up into Eretz Yisrael. So it doesn't qualify as leaving Eretz Yisrael. The whole orientation is towards Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to the others where the orientation is Chutz La'aretz. Now that we know that is the halachic parameters of leaving Eretz Yisrael, we can understand with the story of the Malachim. Because the only reason the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael leave the geographical boundaries of Eretz Yisrael is to go accompany Yaakov into Eretz Yisrael. That does not fall into the category of leaving Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz La'aretz. If I don't have to have an explanation why this is allowed. It only would not be allowed if I was leaving Eretz Yisrael, but I'm not leaving Eretz Yisrael. But you might still have a question. There's another sikha where the Rebbe speaks in great detail about whether Eretz Yisrael was even a holy place yet at that point in time. As the Shittas Rashi is, so in that sikha, the Rebbe explains that from Rashi's perspective, the limitations of leaving Eretz Yisrael, because the question is, how come Avraham Avinu went to Mitzrayim? How come Yaakov went to Mitzrayim? So the whole concept of leaving Eretz Yisrael is not a question for the Avos. Why? Because, what we'll see in a second, the fact that there's no issue leaving Eretz Yisrael is reflected in the fact that the Avos don't hesitate where necessary to leave Eretz Yisrael. Why is that, says Rashi? Because at that point in history, Eretz Yisrael did not yet have this unique holiness that distinguishes it from anywhere else on earth. Biz, as the Das Rashi, is in fact, Rashi, from his perspective, says the ownership of Eretz Yisrael hasn't even yet taken place. In other words, the Jewish ownership of Eretz Yisrael hasn't taken place yet. What about Yitzchak, who's not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael? And so Rashi is avoid the Eibishter's Sonntag to Yitzchak, and the fact that Rashi explains why the Eibishter told Yitzchak, Al Teire Mitzrayim, don't follow your father's example when there was a famine and went to Egypt. You don't go to Egypt. Says Rashi, why is that? Because you have the designation of an oila, a perfect oila that has to be brought up and can only be in the Beis Hamikdash. It's koche kochim, vein chutz l'oretz gedai lecha, and therefore outside of Eretz Yisrael is not suitable for somebody like you, Yitzchak. So maybe that implies that there is kedusha in Eretz Yisrael. That's why Yitzchak can't leave. It's not because the land had fundamentally changed to become what we colloquially call the Holy Land. But rather by Avraham Avinu's own admission, what he had achieved in Eretz Yisrael is that there was consciousness that not only is Hashem an abstraction in heaven, but he's the Elokei Haaretz. The humans in Eretz Yisrael accept and acknowledge that the Eibishter is the Eibishter. I made, says Avraham Avinu, I made the Eibishter's name regular amongst people, in the mouths of people. Whereas Chutz La'aretz, where Avraham Avinu had not operated to that extent, therefore, in Chutz La'aretz, the Eibishter is Elokei HaShamayim, an abstraction. But in a tangible sense, that the Eibishter runs the world, people were not conscious of that. As the Rebbe has explained in great detail elsewhere, therefore Yitzchak, who is a unique person, shouldn't leave Eretz Yisrael. Not because Eretz Yisrael is holy, but because the awareness of godliness is lacking in Chutz La'aretz, and he shouldn't go there. So one second. If Eretz Yisrael is not yet a holy land, and therefore there's no restriction on the Avos leaving Eretz Yisrael, why is there a restriction on the Malachim? By Yitzchak, the fact that he shouldn't be in a place where there isn't that much consciousness of Hashem, that doesn't speak to the Malachim. Malachim don't have these issues that they're going to be amongst people who are not conscious of Hashem. So why is there even a question about the Malachim leaving Eretz Yisrael? It's not a holy place yet. Except that there's a very simple reason why this is. Malachim experienced life differently to humans. The fact that in the time of the Avos, the physical land of Eretz Yisrael did not yet have this unique holiness, nor did it have the Jewish ownership. What does that mean? The intention there is that Gufa Oretz is noch damals nicht niskadish geworden. It means that the physical place hadn't yet been sanctified. Which means there hadn't yet been the establishment of holiness in this entity called the land of Israel. Und der Fall ist bei der Seite in Eretz Yisrael nicht gewend ist, so therefore, if this place hasn't yet been upgraded to a place of holiness, then being physically in that place doesn't restrict you from having to leave that place, so the others could leave. But that's only the physical place. But the concept of Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael animal gewend in Nachlas Hashem Amichedes Sishmoi. Eretz Yisrael was always the Eibishter's inheritance, always dedicated specifically to His name. An Eretz was Vayeitzei Habeira Hayuba. It's a land where the Eibishter's assets are in that land. For example, the ladder in Yaakov Avinu's dream, which is the ladder used for Malachim, where is it located? Specifically in Eretz Yisrael, not some other country. And especially as we know that there's a spiritual Beis Hamikdash that reflects the physical Beis Hamikdash down here. So we put our physical Beis Hamikdash in a location that mirrors where the spiritual Beis Hamikdash sits. That's all the time. Whether there is a physical Beis Hamikdash or not, there's still the place that mirrors the Beis Hamikdash on Maila. There's a similar effect on the whole land of Israel. So the mirror between the holiness and the land is always there. You just don't see it in the land at that point. But Malachim don't have that limitation of not seeing what's going on in the land. That explains how even though for the human Avos living in a physical world, they don't yet have the restriction against leaving Eretz Yisrael because you can't leave that Kedusha, is es aber Yegemen and upheld by Malachim, but the Malachim who operate at a spiritual level and therefore are plugged into the spiritual reality, they do have the limitation of leaving Eretz Yisrael. Because from a Malach's perspective, there is always a difference between Eretz Yisrael and everywhere else, and Eretz Yisrael is always the Nachlas Hashem, and therefore you cannot leave if you're a Malach designated for Eretz Yisrael. So that's the reason why these Malachim could go for this purpose, to welcome Yaakov, even though they're not supposed to leave Eretz Yisrael, because the whole purpose of this mission and the orientation of this journey is into Eretz Yisrael. Now let's understand this concept of these Malachim coming to welcome and accompany Yaakov Avinu in. Let's understand this now at a spiritual level. From Vayeitzei Yaakov Beersheba, the whole story of Yaakov leaving home and going to Haran, which is such a malicious place, is Merabas if Golus Fanam Yisrael is symbolic of the whole Golus of the Jewish people throughout history. Like the Medrash tells us, straight away in the Psukim at the beginning of this parasha Vayeitzei Yaakov, says Rabbi Shimon Levi, Posa Karoya Begolus. He explained all of these psukim to talk about Golus, not only about Yaakov's story, but about Golus. And then the Medrash goes into a lot of detail with the various psukim and how they all describe the Golus. Another Medrash, which we're probably more familiar with, says, that in the dream of the ladder, that the Eibishter showed Yaakov Avinu the four major empires that would exile or would that would wield power over the Jewish people, and how they would all collapse. But the Rambam sagt in Sefer Halacha. In fact, the Rambam even says it in Halacha when he's describing how Nevuah works and that the visions of Nevuah are all symbolic. He says, that the ladder with the malachim going up and down that Yaakov saw in his dream, was a mashal for Golus, for the subjugation that we experienced at the hands of empires. So it's not just like an anecdotal thing. Look, the main thing is it's a story of Yaakov who had to leave home because of his belligerent brother, and he lands up in the unfortunate circumstances in Lavan. No, that's not and by the way, that also represents Golus. No, because the whole point is no similar that whatever happened to the others are simonim, are indicators of what's going to happen to us. Which means that in our Golus B'nei Yisrael, the fact that the Jewish people and the nature of the Golus that the Jewish people experienced, Nemtzich von Maaseh Avos, is derived and is a result of the story of their forefathers. In our case, from Yitzis Yaakov l'chutz la'aretz l'Golus Ba'lovene. In our case, it's the story of Yaakov Avinu going into Golus. That becomes the precursor and the forestory of us going into Golus. Now let's drill down into that story. The fact that Yaakov Avinu had to leave home and go to Haran is not only because of circumstances there was no alternative. The fact that technically Yaakov could not remain in Eretz Yisrael because he had to escape Esav. So that's how you could read the story and say he was forced out. But there's more to the story in the Pshat. Rivka told Yitzchak Avinu that Yaakov has to go there to find a wife. So part of the mission from the get-go was to marry and establish a family. That he should establish a family that becomes a nation. And going to Haran, which is such a lowly place, and working for Lavan, who is such a rogue, is all part of Yaakov's job to refine and elevate the latent kedusha hidden in that space. And that's why it's specifically there in this totally unholy environment that Yaakov Avinu builds the bedrock of the Jewish nation. Rubam kechulam shel hashvatim sanedod giborin, all except one of the shvatim were born there. So that's reflective on the experience of Golus. The Yetzir von Eden from Eretz Yisrael is, why did we have to leave Eretz Yisrael? Because we did things that were inappropriate, therefore we were forced out, like Yaakov was forced out because of Esau. But the purpose of being in Golus, just like Yaakov's purpose in being in Golus is to marry and establish the Jewish people and to elevate Lavan's world, our purpose in Golus is to elevate the world. Like the very blatant statement of Chazal in the Gemara Pesachim, there's no other reason why the Eibush just sent us into exile. The only reason we did it is so we should bring back Gerim. Gerim doesn't just mean human converts. It means to convert things that have latent Kedusha into blatant Kedusha. And as our Rabbeim not only said, but instructed, that our purpose and responsibility is to turn our world into Eretz Yisrael. In other words, to make it absolutely holy. Uftan as Chuslar is Zoverin in the Bechina von Eretz Yisrael, which means to succeed in making the places that are Chutz La'aretz at the level of Eretz Yisrael. Which means an Eretz from Ratzalasis Utzein Koina, a land that wishes to and is enthusiastic to, runs to do what the Eibishter wants, both from Yisrael in a way of Yisrael, which means Sarisim Elikim V'Manoshim Vatuchol, the name that Yaakov Avinu was given to illustrate the capacity to overcome the struggle, not only against physical challenges, but even against spiritual challenges. How do we achieve this goal of what Golus was set out for? By every one of us working to turn the world into Hashem's home, so that through the course of Golus, we bring the Jewish nation to its completion and fruition. So Yaakov Avinu started the Jewish nation in a state of Golus, and we'll bring the Jewish nation to its apex in a state of Golus. And in order to make this happen, there are two types of malach. First, you have the malachim that saw Yaakov to the door, out of Eretz Yisrael. So the malachim of Eretz Yisrael sending Yaakov on his way. That implies that implies the Eibishter giving us the empowerment to succeed in our avodah in Golus. On the union from malachim Eretz Yisrael was boli krasel la'avoisei la'aretz, whereas the malachim we're now talking about that came to welcome Yaakov Avinu back into Eretz Yisrael, that is the teitzor von dem was man hat von Chutz La'aretz gemacht Eretz Yisrael. Those malachim represent the result of us successfully turning the broader world into a holy place like Israel. Bigmar ha'avodah von Yaakov in bechutz la'aretz, when Yaakov completes his avodah outside of Eretz Yisrael, v'bald as dorten gemacht Eretz Yisrael al yidei avodah, because Yaakov succeeded in turning that place Haran into an Eretz Yisrael, in other words, a holy place. So the result of that is malachim of Chutz La'aretz, of Eretz Yisrael, representing the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, come into Chutz La'aretz, implying bringing the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael into Chutz La'aretz. Appear now with that information. And by the way, you see that that at this point, Yaakov Avinu, not only does he take things from Lavan, but even turns Lavan around, etc. And then Lavan changes his tune, and he says, I'm with you, and we're going to make a gal hazer aid, etc. So that's the power of transformation. Not only do you rescue the hostage sparks of Kedusha, but you actually turn the Lavan into something positive. Now with that information, the idea of the malachim of Eretz Yisrael coming to accompany Yaakov into or back into Eretz Yisrael is linked to and a response and result of Yaakov completing his avodah in Chutz La'aretz. Then we can understand at a deeper spiritual level why it is that the roles of these malachim were only to accompany rather than to protect Yaakov. Because to accompany implies showing respect and honor. To understand that, let's look at the language that the Torah uses. This is alluded to when the Torah tells us that he encountered malachim. It's almost like a surprise. In fact, this is similar to language that was used at the beginning of the parasha, where it says that Yaakov encountered the place where he was then going to sleep and have the dream of the malachim, etc. The Zohar links these two psukim because of the common language. The fact that it says he encountered, let's talk about where Yaakov Avinu is on his way out of Eretz Yisrael, and Vayifka b'mokim, he encounters the place. Chazal say, what do you mean you encounter a place? You arrive at a place. What does it mean encounter a place? So firstly, Pegia is an expression of davening. It means that this is where Yaakov Avinu stopped to daven, and specifically Ma'ariv. Which implies as the shaychas zwischen dem Lashon Vayifka bei Malachim zu Shiloch Malachim l'Shem levoya v'chavod, the idea of Vayifku, that Yaakov encounters Malachim that are there in his honor to escort him to Eretz Yisrael, is aderech the shaychas zwischen Lashon Vayifka mit Tfilas Arbes dafka kidel kamon. The meaning, the significance of that phrase that he encounters the Malachim is very much like the concept of Ma'ariv, which Yaakov Avinu introduced. Okay, so let's understand the word Vayifka, and let's understand what is unique about Ma'ariv. Oich. When you say you encounter something, it sounds almost like it was unexpected and unintentional. So once you frame Vayifka as a surprise encounter, it's a little different at the beginning when Yaakov's leaving Eretz Yisrael, and now when he encounters the Malachim. When it says that Yaakov arrived in the place, so to speak, unexpectedly, that implies he didn't see that coming. He's the one who's surprised. As Chazal tell us that the fact that Vayifka, that he encountered the place, tells us he got there far quicker than expected. The Eibishter contracted the space for him. Whereas at the end of the parasha where it says the Malachim encountered Yaakov, is mashmas the Begegnish is given Kilu Shlomo Miskaben, need no mitzad Yaakovin, no ich mitzad Malach Eretz Yisrael. That sounds like mutual surprise. He encounters the Malachim unexpectedly. The Malachim encounter Yaakov unexpectedly. Now that's strange. If they're supposed to come and accompany him, how's it unexpected? As behesem to dem Chilek Hanal in the Vayifka. So once we understand the difference between these two Vayifkas, the surprise for Yaakov and the mutual surprise of Yaakov and the Malachim, then we'll be able to understand is the Chilek in dem Tafkid von die zwei Sugim Malachim. That will clarify for us the different roles of these two groups of Malachim. The first set of malachim that were accompanying Yaakov on his way out, as Rashi identified, they were to protect him. Whereas in the Yisri, Sefer Seder is the Shem Kavod, the malachim at the end of the parasha, those are clearly to honor him. What's the difference? To understand that, let's talk about Ma'ariv. So we know that Chassidus has a radical redefinition of the concept that Ma'ariv is optional. Nit choiva. It's not an obligatory service of davening. Why is that, says Chassidus? As dos is the far was for the service is verbunden mit azah hoiche madrege. That's because Ma'ariv is related to such a high level of spirituality was can the greich werden durch avodas adam that a human cannot attain or achieve through their own efforts. Chassidus explains Ma'ariv represents a gift from Hashem which is so profound that our efforts could never stimulate it. And therefore it flows as if it were automatic, certainly uninvited or unsolicited. Und der Fall lernt man auf Tfilas Arbeit vom Wort Vayifka. That's why the word that represents Tfilas Ma'ariv is Vayifka. He encountered. Nicht wie Asher Omad Shom steht bei Tfilas Shachris von Avram. Not like by Avram Avinu where it says that he went to stand to daven. That emphasizes his input. Or by Yitzchak where it says he went out to speak in the field, implying his input. Was steht bei Tfilas Mincha Shel Yitzchak. But by Ma'ariv Vayifka, he encounters Ma'ariv. It's like such a strange expression. Because Ma'ariv represents such a high level that cannot be accessed through human effort. Rather, the experience of this spiritual level is as if it just happened spontaneously and automatically. So that would then give you the context that your experience of this davening or what this davening produces is as if I never intended to get that. Why did I never intend to get it? Because I know I can't get it. And that fits perfectly with the idea that the Eibusha contracted the space, the distance to get there. And is not something expected, and it's not something you can make happen. No, it is 100% the Eibusha's initiative. It's something that the Eibusha initiates of his own accord. So in the Madrega von Isarusa de Le'ela Guf, now that we've identified that there's this concept of a spontaneous arousal from Hashem, the truth is that could operate in two ways. Something that our efforts cannot reach or stimulate. There's two levels of how that operates. There's first of all the first is the Eibusha's initiative without anything on our part. It's because the Eibusha wants to share chesed, wants to share kindness. Therefore, the Eibusha showers us with something we're not even prepared for. And the objective there is that the Eibusha is prodding us, stimulating us, so we'll respond with some kind of investment. Then there's another kind of divine initiative which is stimulated after we've completed all of our responsibilities. And after we have unlocked all of the potential higher stimulus which we could open, which we could stimulate, then over and above that, the Eibusha then adds bonus spiritual initiation After we've done the max of what we could open, unlock, and stimulate through our avodah, then the Eibusher gives a bonus which is way beyond anything we could reach. And that investment from Hashem is superior to the investment He gave us at the beginning to get us started. Because the original push that the Eibusher gives us is relatively superficial. Whereas the gift that Hashem gives us of something beyond our reach, after we have really worked that hard, is something incredibly profound and personal. And that helps us understand two components of Ma'ariv, because Ma'ariv is quite paradoxical when you think about it. Is at the end of the day or the beginning of the next day? Chassidus is muvor in Zohar, as those was Tfilas Arvis is Rishus. Chassidus quotes the Zohar. Why is it that Ma'ariv is optional? Which means that Ma'ariv represents something beyond human input. Chassidus quotes the Zohar basically saying that's because we've already done Shachris, we've already done Mincha, now we get something which is beyond what we could do. And this is reflected, like all things Chassidus, is reflected in Nigla. As to the service is Kinegedei Vorim Ubdorim, that Ma'ariv represents the leftover limbs and fats of the Karbonas from the Karbonas Shemeshach Hayom, which are obviously from the Karbonas done during the day, like Shachris and Mincha were done during the day. That if they were not burnt up completely on the Mizbech during daylight hours, you allow them to sit and simmer on the base on the Mizbech through the course of the night, and Ma'ariv represents that. Das heißt, as nach der Avodah Sodom die zwei Tfilah sheneged mit dem Tiknum, that means that after you've done this incredible work of Shachris and Mincha, which correspond to the regular Karbonas that are brought on behalf of the community, then to round it off and complete it, you get the input of Ma'ariv. Then you get the input, the inspiration, the gift from the Eibusher, which is not because of, but after we've completed our avodah. Now, when you say that, it doesn't seem to make sense. We know that in Judaism, a day begins at nightfall, which means that the Shachris and Mincha actually began with the Ma'ariv of the night before. So that would imply then that Ma'ariv is not the continuation and completion of what was done with Shachris and Mincha from Friedik and Tog, the Shachris and Mincha of actually the preceding day, because tonight's already tomorrow. Not the Eshet Tefillah from the Mesles. Ma'ariv is really the first Tefillah of the 24 hours that begin tonight. So how do you work this out? And when the Gemara brings them pasuk erev v'voyge v'tzorayim v'goyim, as the pasuk quotes the pasuk, as the Gemara quotes the pasuk that says, evening, morning, and afternoon, I'll praise you. The Gemara applies that to when the different times of davening are. The pasuk starts with the evening. The first tefillah is Ma'ariv, then Shachris, then Mincha. So how do you reconcile? Is Ma'ariv the gift after Shachris and Mincha, or is Ma'ariv the stimulus for Shachris and Mincha? So it's exactly the same as the two sets of Malachim. In Ma'ariv has both forms of Isurus D'Le'ela. The Ma'ariv that starts a 24-hour period is the Madrega von Isurus D'Le'ela Shelifnei O Isurus D'Lesata Anal. That is the empowering Isurus D'Le'ela that starts the process flowing, like the Malachim seeing Yaakov into his journey. Was dieses D'Le'ela ist von der Madrega, was ist Hechel von Avodah Sodom, aber nimmt sich in Anleifen mitzad Chafetz Chesed Hu Rishus. So that is a stimulus from the Eibusher that is beyond human reach, and therefore is this gift, this Rishus, this Ma'ariv that the Eibusher gives us to start us going. And therefore it belongs at the beginning of the day, because it is to empower us to get through the day and achieve our avodah of the day. Then there's another layer and level of Ma'ariv, which is the Ma'ariv after Shachris and Mincha, after you've done what you had to do the whole day. Then is this then it is a tremendous gift from the Eibusher that is completely beyond anything not only that we could achieve, but even that we could imagine, and yet it is a response to our doing our avodah. Shleim as beprotis is das the chilek zwischen die zwei psukim beparash seinu, and with that we can clearly distinguish between the two psukim of Pegia in our parasha. Vayifka b'mokoim, when Yaakov is the only one who, wow, how did I get here? V'shteit b'tchilas haseder, which is quoted at the beginning of the parasha, compared to the mutual surprise or the mutual unexpected encounter of Yaakov and the Malachim described at the end of the parasha. The beginning of the parasha, Yaakov is just starting his mission. So he needs and gets the first kind of spiritual initiative, divine initiative. Which is the divine initiative to empower a person to do what they have to do, for Yaakov to be able to do his mission. And therefore, the unexpected nature of this encounter is only on Yaakov's part. As Yaakov is getting something which is as if he didn't intend to get. It's a surprise for him. And because it is a divine gift that is not the result of his input. But after he concludes all of his avoid in Lavan's house, and likewise, all of us, the Jewish people, when we conclude and complete our avodah through Golus, after we have solicited all of the things that human endeavor can achieve, then we receive this unlimited Isarusa Deleida from Hashem as a gift. This is described as the Malachim encountering Yaakov. Here, the unexpected aspect is not just Yaakov, I haven't done anything yet, and you're already giving me an Isarusa Deleila. But it's such a high, elevated Isarusa Deleila, it's even, so to speak, surprising to Lamaila. Why? Because if something is flowing from Ein Sof, it feels seamless, it feels effortless. And that's why. How does this manifest in Malachim from Eretz Yisrael coming out to accompany Yaakov back to Eretz Yisrael? The previous Malachim were to protect him. That represents the Eibishter helping us, protecting us to be able to do our avodah. And it also implies we need that help, we need that protection. Whereas these malachim were coming to welcome Yaakov to Eretz Yisrael, that is just a matter of kavod. That is just illustrating that Yaakov has achieved great things. That's because now you're getting a gift from the Eibishter, which is exponentially beyond anything you could achieve, but the recipient is in a good, healthy space, in a full, complete space. So it doesn't need protection from anything inappropriate. Not only does the person not need protection, the person's not lacking anything. There's no impediment from any of the response from the Eibishter that this person deserves. It's all like this massive gift that he's getting. Yeah, the Indian in Torah is as we well know. Torah means instruction, therefore everything in the Torah is there to teach us a lesson. This too. The fact that the Torah is telling us that when Yaakov is still in Chutz La'aretz, which means he's still in Golus, before he reaches Eretz Yisrael, the fact is the Eibishter sends him malachim while he's in Golus, while he's in Chutz La'aretz. The Eibishter sends him malachim to bring him to Eretz Yisrael. The reason for that is to illustrate to us how incredibly great our avodah is. And that should give us a lot of energy, resource, and encouragement to do our avodah. Even when Yidden are still in Golus. We tell every single Jew, not only should you not be overwhelmed or afraid of Golus, or the secularism that surrounds us in Golus. Don't worry, there are malachim in Chutz La'aretz. If you're in Golus, the Eibishter dispatches malachim to protect you in Golus. Und Loyana Valishan Shem Yisrael Game Hashem Shebrech Hashem Tzilcha Yad Yaminecha, the Eibush doesn't slumber or sleep. He's your God, He's your shadow at your side. Bizas Vahim Lachem Umnayich V'Sor Semnike Sayich Noch Bisman Golus. Even to the extent that even during Golus we see the non-Jewish world helping us, like they will in the time of Mashiach. And Nachmer, it's more than that. The Eibush Shik Malach Eretz Yisrael Lavoisoi. Not only does the Eibush send us Malachim to protect us, that the Golus shouldn't swallow us up, but He sends us Malachim to accompany, to escort us. If Moses sein in sein cover, to add to our dignity. Das heißt, in other words, sein nicht nispol werden von Golus und Goyishkeit. It's not stam in a Golus dicken Eufen. That means not only am I in a Golus mentality, not afraid of Golus, not in our chovo, in our Geula dicken Eufen, but rather with absolute calm, with absolute confidence, in a Geula headspace. Malacha Eretz Yisrael ba'ifin shel kavod. I'm surrounded by and guided by Malachim that belong in Eretz Yisrael, that belong in a time of Geula, that take me in a dignified fashion. I have nothing to be afraid of, and I don't have to be fakfetch. I could be like the most secure person. And that's me, dear Git, how you suffer us, Idud v'chizuk in the Gemara, avoid in the Seif Siman HaGolus. Knowing this gives us a tremendous boost in fulfilling our avoid at the end of Golus. Men soll nicht rechnen sich klar mit Goyishkeit, that we should completely disregard the secularism and its influences. Now again, levetach darkoi, but to be completely confident in our path. If Goyma sein, the avoid from the Pachim Ktanim, to conclude those small packages that are required for in noch gebrin levaron in the avoid Bisman HaGolus, that are required to be refined in our period of Golus. And das im Mario, das reingehen von jeden Eden und alle Eden in Eretz Yisrael mit der Malachim shel Eretz Yisrael, that will hasten every one of us being able to enter Eretz Yisrael with our guardian angels in our Neufim von Achishena. It should happen sooner than expected. B'mheira v'yomeinu mamash, literally now.